With the latest agriculture news from across the state and nation, it's time for the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. Here's your host, Sabrina Halverson.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us today on the AgNet News Hour. Coming up in a little bit, I get to talk with a best-selling author who wrote a new book on botanists in Russia who risked their lives and even some losing their lives to protect the world's agricultural seeds. This happened during World War II. It's an amazing story that's being told for the first time, and I'm excited to share that interview with you. So we'll be talking with author Simon Parkin later in the show, but we're starting off today with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Here's Hunter Ehrman.
The federal government is currently developing the 2025 to 2030 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. This is a document that informs federal policies on everything from school lunches to chronic disease prevention. Unfortunately, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, which is tasked with providing recommendations in the process, has decided that Americans should reduce their consumption of red meat, including beef, and replace it with beans, peas, and lentils. This recommendation will now go to the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services for consideration and possible inclusion in the final dietary guidelines. Joining us for an update on this is Dr. Shailene McNeil, a registered dietitian and NCBA Executive Director of Nutrition Science. Shailene, thank you so much for being here today. What can you tell us about the recommendations from the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee?
Well, thanks, Hunter. Earlier this week, we saw a preview of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee recommendations. And what we're seeing is that they are disregarding the body of science and the reality of how great of a job beef is doing in protecting Americans from nutrient gaps. They're actually recommending a reduction in red meat, replacing it with beans, peas, and lentils. And we absolutely know that beans, peas, and lentils are no substitute for beef. We're not going to get the same quality of protein. We're not going to get the same available iron and nutrients. And we simply do not have the wiggle room to cut back in beef in the diet for a healthy diet in America today.
Shailene, if Americans start reducing their meat intake and they follow these types of recommendations, what types of health outcomes would we see?
Well, what we've seen is the past 4 decades, we have had dietary guidelines for Americans that gently nudge Americans to eat less red meat, and they've done that. And all we've seen is rising rates of obesity, rising rates of chronic disease, and more recent research is just continuing to come out to show that as we've declined our red meat intake, our iron deficiency rates are on the rise. Other nutrients associated with beef are also on the rise. So we're headed in the wrong direction with regards to our nutritional adequacy in the United States, and beef can help offset and close those nutrient gaps that we're facing.
Well, Shailene, this advisory committee meeting is one of the first steps in the process of crafting the 2025 to 2030 dietary guidelines for Americans. How do the dietary guidelines impact consumers?
The dietary guidelines for Americans are very important to consumers, whether they realize it or not, or whether we as producers can feel the dietary guidelines or not, right? They form the basis of federal nutrition policy. So I often say if it's not in the dietary guidelines, it's not going to be on the school lunch program. It's not going to be in the military feeding programs. It also is the key document that informs so much of what health professionals like myself use to recommend healthy diets. So physicians and dietitians are looking to the dietary guidelines for advice. So it's a critical document, and it's really important that we are involved in shaping the input and the research on this document because there's so much good news. There's so much great research about beef out there to show how beef can play a very important role in nourishing Americans today.
Shailene, you mentioned the important role of beef in the diet, but can you expand on that and explain how beef fits into a healthy diet?
Well, few foods offer the nutritional package that beef offers. We often talk about foods like vegetable, like broccoli. Well, broccoli has some fiber and maybe 1 or 2 nutrients, really important food. Beef has 10 essential nutrients, great quality protein. And not only that, Hunter, we're providing a food that people love to eat. I often say that beef is a staple in the American diet. Over 80% of people identify themselves as meat eaters. Most people are buying beef, putting it in their cars, bringing it home and preparing it, and they want to eat a healthier meal with beef. So it's a staple food in the diet, and because of that, it can help offset nutrient gaps and nourish Americans.
Shailene, one of the concerns NCBA raised is that this recommendation for more beans, peas, and lentils just doesn't fit with consumers' tastes and really doesn't fit with consumers' needs for accessible and affordable meals. Could you expand on that and discuss how this will impact consumers' access to protein?
This is one of the things I was so surprised about with this committee's preview. They said all along that they wanted these dietary guidelines to be practical and relevant and achievable. And I think about this a lot, not only as a nutrition scientist and a registered dietitian, but also as a mom who's raised 2 kids. We want to eat healthier. I try to be fit and eat healthier. And even with a PhD, it can be challenging at times. And so I think that we need to encourage foods that people enjoy eating that we know are nutrient dense. There's no better example of that than beef. And that's what it's going to take. It's going to take practical advice, meeting people where they are. People are eating beef. They're getting great nutrition from it. And we need to embrace that rather than discourage it in the American diet.
So now that we've had this development from the meeting of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, what is the next step in the process?
So now we await this committee's report, the written report. And we expect to see that written report sometime before December 9th. They have to turn that report in by December 9th. And then we expect that there will be a comment period where the public can weigh in on comment. I'm sure NCBA will be weighing in on comments. The producers can weigh in on comments. The public should weigh in if they care about nutrition and health and enjoy beef eating. So we'll have that opportunity. And then the USDA and Health and Human Services will take those recommendations and eventually make them into what we know as the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, the policy report, we often say. So that'll happen over the next year once that report is released and those agencies start developing the actual dietary guidelines for Americans.
Well, Dr. McNeil, thanks so much for joining us and giving us an update today. Now, this is an issue where we need cattle producers to weigh in and let their members of Congress know what's going on. You can do that by visiting our website, ncba.org/policy, and clicking on our letter to Congress, or you can text the word beef to 52886, and you'll receive a link so that you can send a note directly to your members of Congress.
This is the AgNet News Hour. We'll be back in just a moment.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halverson.
Foreign ownership of U.S. farmland is an extremely hot topic. Gary Crawford looks into it further in this edition of Agriculture USA.
Food security is national security.
Senate Ag Committee Chair Debbie Stabenow opening up a special hearing the other day to explore how foreign ownership of U.S. farmland and food-related companies might be a threat to national security, and if so, what to do about it. It's an interesting, controversial issue, and we'll hear more about it on this edition of Agriculture USA. I'm Gary Crawford. Opinions on the issue of foreign ownership of U.S. farmland and other ag-related businesses vary widely. Some say the amount of U.S. farmland owned by China, for example, is only 0.5% of all U.S. ag land owned by interests outside the U.S., and so that may not be a threat. Others, such as Montana's Senator John Tester, disagree, especially when it comes to specific countries.
When we're talking about the Chinese Communist Party putting up a corn milling plant within miles of a sensitive Air Force base, we need to make sure that this doesn't happen. Because quite honestly, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, they are not friends of ours. They want to make us less than what we are today. So we shouldn't allow these bad actors to be on our soil. Honestly, the fact is that if they're there to have impacts on our food supply, that's bad business. If they're there to spy on us, they shouldn't be allowed to spy on us anywhere in the world, and certainly not on our own soil.
But USDA Deputy Undersecretary Gloria Montano Green told lawmakers that while many people believe the U.S. Department of Agriculture should go ahead, just move in and tightly restrict foreign purchases of U.S. ag land, the fact is,
our authority does not allow us to stop the selling of foreign land. We do not have authority to have a decision in foreign or domestic land purchases and leases.
USDA does have the job of tracking and disclosing land deals, but the system for doing that is a complex patchwork.
There are more than 3,000 county clerks and recorders' offices, more than 50 state systems, and more than 500 sovereign tribal nations processing and tracking of land ownership and land transfer.
And this reporting process is still being done on paper. A few days ago, Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack talked about this foreign investment issue with reporters at the White House.
Well, I think there's concern, as there was in the North Dakota circumstance, where the Chinese interest was purchasing land near a military installation. I think there's legitimate concerns in that space.
He said there are many angles to this issue, and he also said USDA has the job of tracking land ownership changes, but it's a very complex job, again, given the current system.
I would also say that I think there's work to be done to give us the tools to be able to do an even better job of ensuring that we know when these transactions take place. It's complicated, but every county has their county recorder. And on any given day, somebody may walk into that recorder's office and file a deed, and there's no way of knowing precisely whether or not that is a Chinese purchaser. We need to work on how we might be able to collect the information and be able to analyze that information in a timely way so that we would determine whether or not a threat exists or not.
And that is the big question to be answered in specific cases, but also in general. Meanwhile, foreign purchases of U.S. farmland are growing, but foreign holdings still amount to a small fraction of all U.S. farmland.
Currently, 3.1% of American agricultural land is foreign-owned. Contrary to popular belief, foreign governments don't typically own this land.
That's Dr. David Ortega with Michigan State University. He says most of the foreign-owned U.S. farmland is owned by business interests in Canada and Europe, not by governments, not by China. Dr. Ortega also says that many people believe foreign purchases of U.S. land are causing land prices to rise and become too expensive for small and mid-sized farmers to afford.
However, there is no clear evidence that foreign ownership is causing U.S. farmland prices to rise.
So, Dr. Ortega says right now Chinese ownership of U.S. farmland poses little threat to U.S. food security, but he does see a threat from the Chinese from another direction.
I would consider China's investments in agricultural research and technology one of the biggest threats to our food security. They are currently spending 5 times more on research and development today than they were 2 decades ago. In comparison, here in the U.S., our spending and investment has fallen, and it's fallen by about a third over the last 2 decades. And it is about half of what China is spending, and their trajectory is upward. We are falling behind, and it's what I would consider to be one of the most serious threats to our food security, is their level of investment.
Investments in agricultural science and technology, not necessarily in U.S. land, although he says that is a growing sector, but right now it does not pose a major threat to the security of agriculture USA. I'm Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington.
This is the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halverson. We'll be back in just a moment.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halverson.
Joining me now is best-selling author Simon Parkin. All right, Simon, I've been looking forward to this interview so much I can't even tell you. I have started reading your book, and I'm just completely enthralled by it. So for our listeners, would you start out giving them kind of an overview of what your book is about?
Yes. Firstly, thanks so much. I'm so glad you're enjoying it. The book is about the world's first seed bank, which was set up in the 1920s in the Russian city of what is now known as St. Petersburg. It was for many years during the Soviet Union known as Leningrad. And it was set up by an international renowned explorer and botanist called Nikolai Vavilov. And he had an idea that perhaps when farmers were selecting the grains that they were going to use to produce wheat and other things hundreds of years ago, they may have overlooked some of the rarer plants that thrive in quite difficult circumstances on the sides of mountains or other areas that are less accessible, let's say, and that perhaps some of those rare plants might have characteristics that could prove useful to modern farmers. So that would be resistant to cold temperatures or to diseases or other things. And so Vavilov wanted to go around the world collecting as many plants and seeds as he could, bringing them back to the middle of the city, Leningrad, where he was going to do experiments on the seeds and perhaps crossbreed them, create hybrids with a view to increasing the yield of farmers' crops. And so he did this all through the 1920s and 1930s, amassing a collection of about 250,000 seeds and plants, all housed in this former palace in the middle of the city off St. Isaac's Square. And so my book is about the botanists who worked at that seed bank during, for those who don't know, the city of Leningrad was surrounded by the German army in the summer of 1941. And so began the longest siege of any city in recorded human history. It lasted almost 900 days. And the botanists were charged with protecting the seed bank while they were trying to fend off their own hunger pangs and also assaults by vermin and intruders and other people who were trying to get hold of the collection in order to eat it.
And so there's so many intricacies that go into it, that are just in this story. And that's what I find fascinating is, first off, they're not just defending, items. They're defending the world's food supply, essentially. The seed bank carrying or storing seeds for everything. If we were to lose that, it's important. If we were to lose access to those seeds, it could be pretty devastating. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, Vavilov had been motivated by the idea that some of these seeds and plants were going to be lost in the loss of habitat. So either due to building or cities expanding or even war, which of course can destroy habitats and destroy areas where there might be rare plants. So that was part of the reason that he was going around with his botanists. He visited all 5 continents. He picked up barley from the plateaus by India and Afghanistan, and flax in Iran, and oranges and lemons on the road to Kabul. And he even went as far as Tokyo in Japan, picking burdock and edible lilies and chrysanthemums and other things, and sweet potatoes from Taiwan. And a delegation went to South America and found very rare potatoes there as well. And so some of these crops and seeds were perhaps no longer available, even at the time when the siege began. They were just irreplaceable. You wouldn't have been able to go back to the habitats where they first found them because those habitats had been lost. So really, for the botanists who worked at the seed bank, I think they had a sense that the collection they were looking after and entrusted with was extremely valuable. And actually across the St. Isaac's Square is the Hermitage Museum, where it's filled with paintings by masters and priceless treasures, and lots of those items were evacuated from the city as soon as Germany invaded the Soviet Union and stored in the mountains far inland in Russia. Whereas the seed bank, it took a long time for them to organize their collection and to hear from the government that they were allowed to evacuate them. And so by the time that they're finally told that they can box up lots of their rare seeds and put them on a train out of Leningrad, it's already too late. And they're also, it's worth saying, doing all of this while they're leaderless. So Vavilov has, by the time of the siege, been arrested by Stalin, who is suspicious of him and his international connections and lots of other elements to his work. And it's while Vavilov is out collecting seeds on a mountainside that a car pulls up and 4 suspicious looking characters get out and say, "You're needed in Moscow with us on important business." And he gets into the car not knowing that they're members of the NKVD, which is the precursor to the KGB. And so Vavilov's arrested and put on a trial and then sent to the Gulag. So at the start of the siege, the botanists inside the seed bank don't have a leader, and so they're trying to figure out what to do among themselves.
We're talking with best-selling author Simon Parkin, who wrote a book about botanists in Russia who protected the world's agricultural seeds. We'll be back and continue the conversation in just a moment.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halverson.
Speaking again this morning with Simon Parkin, who is the author of The Forbidden Garden. And your book, now, it's nonfiction, but it reads like a novel, and a really gripping one. And you explained in the beginning how you did that, but the amount, I can't even imagine the amount of research that you put in, because I can almost feel the environment around the people in the city and what they are seeing and what they're smelling. So how much research did you put into this?
Yes, there's lots of literature about the siege of Leningrad. So, of course, I've benefited from reading those books that have been written over the decades. But in terms of the details specific to the seed bank and the botanists, I wrote to the seed bank, which is still in Russia, it's still functioning. And in fact, many of the scientists who work there still work in the same rooms where the botanists before them lived, and in some cases died during the 1940s, and asked them if I might come and visit and look through their archives. And that was the plan until Russia invaded Ukraine, and that made visiting the country much harder, especially for a British person like me. But thankfully, there was an archivist at the seed bank who offered to scan all of the documents that were relevant to what I was doing and send them to me. And so she did that, and then I was able to translate those, and then piece by piece start putting together the story of what their lives would have been like week by week as the winter draws in, as the food supplies start to dwindle, and as they're faced with this terrible decision. Are they going to eat the collection of seeds and sustain their own lives for a little bit longer, or are they going to try to save it and deny themselves in order that when the siege breaks, they might be able to plant the fields and replenish the collection?
I can't even imagine having to make a decision like that in my life. Just what these people went through and the personal sacrifices that they made to protect these seeds are just enormous. And you really give a sense of that in the book.
Yeah, it was for me looking at the story all these decades later. It can sometimes be a little bit difficult to understand perhaps why the scientists made the decisions that they did. People are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in Leningrad are starving to death. There's very little food able to get into the city. This is in particular during the first winter. And the seed bank is being assaulted by rats that have smelt the seeds and want to try and find a way in to eat them. And these people here have very little strength, and they're trying to do the best that they can. And they decide not to eat the collection, and 19 of them starve to death because of that decision, some of them while still sitting at their desks, sorting the seeds and cataloguing them and continuing in their work. So yeah, it's difficult to understand why someone might make that decision. And in fact, after the war ends, a journalist went to visit some of the survivors, and he asked them, why would you make this decision? Why wouldn't you choose to eat the almonds or the cashew nuts or whatever it was that might have prolonged your life? And one of the botanists answers, you're a journalist, you're a writer. Imagine you'd been working for years and years on your life story, and suddenly the temperatures drop and you're freezing to death, and you're faced with a decision. Are you going to burn the manuscript to your book, the only existing copy of it, in order to save your life? Or perhaps are you not going to do that so that your work can live on? And he says, perhaps now you understand why we made the decision that we made. To eat the collection would have been to betray our work, the work of our colleagues, their sacrifices that they'd made over the years. And so that's what gave them impetus to make the decision that they did.
Yeah. I want to ask, obviously not your first book, how did writing this book compare to the books that you've written previously?
It was a big challenge to write this book because of not being able to look at the firsthand documents personally, and not being able to talk to, even if there were any survivors, and we don't think there are any people still alive from that time, then at least their family members. And of course, not being able to visit St. Petersburg, I wasn't able to do that. So that was quite different to, I've written 2 non-fiction books before about the Second World War and about non-combatants and their acts of heroism. And in those cases, I was able to speak to the family members, and in a couple of cases, still people who were still alive, and to read their first-hand accounts and their diaries. The difference with this story as well is that their heroism was to a certain degree covered up for many years. Still during the Soviet years of the Soviet Union, there was some embarrassment about what had happened to Nikolai Vavilov, who had been essentially murdered by the state. And there was some disinformation as well, stories going around that the botanists had eaten the seeds, and it took a very long time for the full picture to start to emerge. So for that reason, I think the botanists who did survive perhaps didn't write down their memories with the same degree of freedom that we might have done in the West, perhaps. And so, yeah, that just made it that much harder to bring myself and hopefully the reader into those circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Was there anything that you were really surprised to learn as you were doing your research for the book?
Yeah, I think reading the broader picture of what life is like in a city with 3 million people when no food is entering the city is almost unthinkable for us today, but it really wasn't that long ago. And reading some of the accounts of what people went through and the decisions that they made, and the different responses to the need around them. You have some mothers and who start to share their tiny, meager rations with orphans, perhaps, that live next door. And there are acts of generosity and kindness. But just equally, as there would be in any cross-section of humans, there are also people who steal and even murder in order to get hold of food. And there are even accounts of cannibalism in the city as well. You get the full picture of everything that went on. Families are having to debate whether to eat their pets or to swap them with their neighbors, their pets, so that it's not quite so difficult. But of course, these things are so hard for us to imagine when we're not in those circumstances. And I think reading those accounts from so many different sources who lived during that time, it was pretty harrowing, I would say.
Absolutely. But again, just a fascinating book. As we wrap up, what would you hope that our listeners understand from our conversation and also from your book? What message do you really want them to get from this?
The key question I try and wrestle with in the book is whether the scientists made the right decision in giving their lives to save the collection. And I think it's something that, regardless of whether you work with plants or in farming or whatever, you can put yourself in their shoes to a certain degree. One thing that I was astonished to realize is that the collection that they do save does go on to do amazing things. By the mid-1960s, 100 million acres of Russian agricultural land had been planted out with seeds that came from the Institute's collection. And by 1979, that had almost doubled. And today, 90% of the seeds and crops in the seed bank in St. Petersburg are found in no other collection in the world. So I think when it comes to the question of whether they made the right choice or not, we have to look at the impact of what they did and the lasting dividends of it as well. And yeah, that's a complicating element to this story, but one that I think makes it so interesting and, for me at least, really compelling.
Again, the book is The Forbidden Garden. That's Simon Parkin. Thank you for joining us today, Simon. This is the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halverson, and we'll be back in just a moment. This segment is brought to you by Live Earth Products. To get to know a little more about Live Earth Products, we're talking on the phone today with Vice President Russell Taylor. For the Conservationist of the Year, what goals would you like to see occur this year?
So this is continuing work as the Certified Crop Advisor Conservationist of the Year. They're looking for certified crop advisors who are trying to aid farmers in getting information or conservation practices. One thing we've identified that is keeping farmers from getting conservation practices is actually just information and products. The current federal regulations actually were written in the 1950s. And at that time, those rules were only restricting fertilizers and pesticides. They didn't put into account other developing technologies such as plant biostimulants and some of these newer technologies we're using in agriculture. And so for 2024, our goal is to really help change the laws that are impacting biostimulant regulation to allow them to be used and treated as a fertilizer, not as a pesticide.
So what does that process look like to go through that and get that change to be where it needs to be?
Well, actually, there's a very long on-ramp. We've been working on this since 2014, and the bricks that we've laid on this path are now hopefully being included in the Farm Bill. So more than anything now, it's just supporting the work we've already done, trying to get legislators aware of the problem and hopefully enact those rules. There's an act right now by California regulators. It's called the Plant Biostimulant Act. And so the best thing that farmers can do is call up and say, hey, we support this language. This is going to give us more tools to enact those conservation practices and have more products available to us.
To get to know more about Live Earth Products, you can visit them online at liveearth.com. That is spelled LIVEARTH.com.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halverson.
For this segment, I'm handing the mic over to Cindy Zimmerman. Here's Cindy.
Today I'm going to learn about a company called Terviva and a crop called pongamia. With me are two executives with Terviva, and I'd like them to first introduce themselves. First, starting with you, Naveen.
Hi, I'm Naveen Sika. Great to be here with you, Cindy. Thanks for having us. I'm the founder and CEO of Terviva. I've been doing this now at Terviva for getting on to close to 15 years. The company is 100% focused on pongamia. Prior to that, I actually came out of grad school where I was looking at this whole entire space of feedstocks for renewable fuels. And prior to that, I worked in a set of general business functions around the natural resources, life sciences, and agriculture space. And I'm joined here with my colleague, Simar Singh. We call him Simar. Simar, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so hello, Cindy. Glad to be here. I joined Terviva recently, but before this, I've had some close to 3 decades of experience in the wild harvest as well as in the edible oil and oil seeds space, having spent time in Africa, in Latin America, doing peanuts farming and processing for edible oil, as well as the edible grade peanuts. And then moving back to India, again with 2 multinationals into the same space of edible oil, where we had been doing soybean, palm oil refining and selling to the stakeholders and clients in the Asian geographies. So glad to be here and working with a product which is the necessary option at this stage of, in the food and feed space.
Well, Simar, you just recently joined the company. What made you want to be a part of Terviva?
So, there's this constant debate which has been going on in the food versus fuel space. And ultimately, organizations have had to choose the right option to maximize their objectives as aligned with their vision. But there's always been a trade-off between how much to send for food and how much to take away from food into the fuel space. And here I see one product and technology which is providing a source which comes out of this debate. Low carbon source which can be grown on lands where you can't grow a soya, a corn, or a sugarcane. And as such, it is not taking away anything from the food. It's adding to the whole space. So it is a bit of a new thing, and I think an option which the world needs, and that's what brings me here.
All right. Well, Naveed, could you give us a little bit more information first about Terviva and Pongamia, a little bit about your company's background, your goals, and your mission?
Yeah, so Terviva is 100% focused on Pongamia, which is a truly remarkable tree. It fits into this category of what we call semi-domesticated trees, or sometimes people call these indigenous community crops. These are minor crops typically grown in the frontline communities around the world where farming is tough. And these crops were grown like a shea nut, like a castor, like a pongamia, because they had some marginal value in those communities, and they could be grown on pretty poor quality land with limited water and limited inputs like fertilizer and no pesticides. So there's a bunch of what we call semi-domesticated crops like this around the world. Pongamia, people have been talking about it for renewable fuels for, going on 2 decades now, because number one, it's a tree. And so it gives you a different way to produce feedstock than your typical annual crops. You can think about, for example, in smallholding farmer systems, you can integrate trees with grazing animals or even with other types of crops. So you get mixed land use. The other thing that's excited people about Pongamia is that it has shown the potential, not consistently, but shown the potential to yield lots of beans on a tree, which would confer to basically being able to produce a lot of oil. So we started Terviva with the idea that you could create a permanent crop or a perennial crop form of biofuel feedstock production that has the potential to rival the yields of oil palm, which is, basically the highest form of oil yield per acre on land on Earth. And we've been able to work on it now for 15 years with a fair bit of capital to fulfill that promise. So we've got, after extensive plantings and research and development, we've got non-GMO tree varieties that can produce more oil per acre than the best Midwest soybean land. In fact, multiples of that, 4 to 5 times that than the best Midwest soybean land. And you're growing on land where you couldn't grow soy at all. So I think it's a very exciting prospect for the space. I think moreover, because it's a bean, you have that secondary stream of protein, basically a protein carbohydrate bean meal, like a soybean meal. And we can use that in the growing markets for animal feed around the world. And both of these things, the oil and the protein, can be upgraded into human applications, which just gives you a little bit of diversification in the market where you can get that extra margin for your farmer that's growing this, that they're often looking for to make sure they can maximize what they make. So it's been very exciting. It does not feel like 15 years, to be honest. I feel like, for myself and for our teammates that have been around for 15 years or less than that, the energy is really strong right now in the moment that we find ourselves in to really power forward pongamia as a promising feedstock for renewable fuels.
All right, I'm having a little trouble visualizing pongamia. Never heard of this, never seen this type of tree or crop. Could you tell us a little bit more about it? Is it like a coffee bean, or what is it?
Sure. If you're out here in California, you think about all those acres of walnuts or almonds or pistachios that we have. If you're thinking about an almond tree, think about soybeans on an almond tree. Think about a pod that has a big bean in it. The tree is full of these pods, and inside you have these beans that have oil and have protein in them. So it is a legume. It just happens to be a legume tree.
So what's the investment as far as growing the tree and getting it to be producing? How long does it take for a tree to start producing a crop?
Yeah, just like it's very familiar in its, I'll call it biology and economics, to other types of tree crops. So when you plant a tree crop in the ground, obviously it's not very big. You got to give it time to get up there and grow and then produce a large enough crop. In Pongamia's case, because it's a fast growing tree, we are actually able to get that tree up to size and producing a large enough crop by around year 4. And that allows us to run mechanized harvesting equipment. So, again, if you're familiar with almonds or pistachios, you don't hand harvest these crops, you use mechanized equipment to do that. We're able to do the same thing with pongamia, which makes it super scalable if you're growing it in high cost geographies like the United States or Australia. And again, if you flip over to lower cost geographies like where we're working in India or perhaps other places in Southeast Asia, you can imagine, not a whole acre full of pongamia trees, but maybe 20 or 30 trees on an acre where there's other crops or livestock on that field. And, again, by year 4, you'll get a large enough crop to get some good cash flow for the farmer. And, they may be tending to that crop more manually than we might, in a higher cost geography and with a lot more automation like the US.
This is the AgNet News Hour, and we'll continue with Cindy Zimmerman right after this. We continue now with Cindy Zimmerman.
So then what type of climate does pongamia do best in? Where can it be grown?
Yeah, so it's considered native to lots of countries in the world, pretty much all throughout Southeast Asia and Asia, from India going through to, Malaysia and Indonesia and all the way into Australia. That's where it's considered native or naturalized. But believe it or not, Cindy, it also has been in the United States for over 100 years. It was brought into Florida and brought into Hawaii. These are the warmest places that we can grow in the U.S., and pongamia typically prefers warm weather. It doesn't tolerate well to freezes. So that's why we started to grow it here in the U.S. in those 2 geographies.
Well, so you've said that this crop has a potential for food, feed, and fuel, and it certainly seems like it is definitely a good potential then for sustainable aviation fuel, right?
I definitely think so. One of the interesting parts about that market is that it's very consumer facing compared to, I would say, your average, on-road renewable transportation fuel. So airlines always like to talk about what they're doing to, make sure they're contributing to, fighting climate change and improving sustainability. And there's a great story behind the pongamia tree. Everything that, Simmer said earlier and what I added to, there's a real opportunity for airlines to talk about how they're making a real difference in farmer livelihoods, how they're also contributing to, a different way of producing hyper sustainable fuels through a crop like pongamia. And, we're excited to take our oil and put it into the SAF market with partners like Mitsubishi and Chevron.
Well, that brings us to your big announcement with Chevron Renewable Energy Group, and for the purpose of scaling up pongamia to be used as a feedstock for renewable fuels production. Tell us about this big news.
Chevron is a real leader globally on all things renewable fuels and, frankly, all things transportation fuels in general. Obviously, they have a very big footprint here in the U.S., and the U.S. is the #1 market for alternative fuels in the world. So it's amazing to partner with an organization that can help us bring our feedstock to market at scale. We've known the organization for a long time now. I've taken colleagues from Chevron REG down to our fields in Florida for over a decade now, and we've kept in good touch. And finally, as we sort of de-risked a lot of the technology, both on the genetic side and also on the product side, it made good sense to get back together and to talk about how we could scale this. And that obviously led to the partnership, which is also followed by an investment and a deep commitment to integrate pongamia into the feedstock mix. I think it occupies a unique space out there. It's not your traditional commodity crop like soybean or canola, nor is it a short rotation cover crop. It's this permanent crop that, we like to compare it to actually basically putting an oil well in the ground. When farmers spend the money to plant a tree to get it in the ground, they're not going to change their mind the next year or the year after that, like they might with an annual crop. This is the crop, the pongamia tree, that'll yield for 20 or 30 years. And, it'll produce, 400 or 500 gallons per acre per year at maturity. So you could do that. You could do that oil field type calculation with pongamia, where you're getting a 20-year asset that's going to produce a lot of green crude. And I think that's attractive to a lot of energy companies that are looking to increase their feedstock mix. It's a different way to do it. It has a unique spot, and pongamia is the leading permanent crop with which to do it.
Thank you to Cindy Zimmerman for that interview. That's our show for today. I'm Sabrina Halverson. Thank you for sharing your morning with us.
To get more information on the topics you heard today, visit AgNet West at agnetwest.com. You can also stay connected by following us on our social media at AgNet West on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Also look for Sabrina Halverson on Facebook, and be sure to subscribe to our podcast by searching for AgNet West on your podcast app. Thank you for listening to the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. AgNet West Radio Network, your primary choice for agriculture news.